my name is Dr. Liz Burton-Crow, and I'm the Director of Education for the Crueltyfree Center for Nonviolence. Welcome back to Living One, our free monthly webinar series where presenters from around the world share their vision about psychology, life, and culture in the absence of animal exploitation. Through Living One, we attempt to answer the question, we know it's wrong, but what does right look like? This month, we welcome ecologist and author Carl Safina, who explores how humans are changing the living world and what those changes mean for wild places and for human and other beings. His work connects broad scientific understanding with a moral call to action. His writing has won the MacArthur Genius Prize, Pew and Guggenheim Fellowships, book awards from Lannan, Orion, and the National Academies, and the John Burroughs, James Beard, and George Rabb medals. Safina hosted the 10-part PBS series, Saving the Ocean with Carl Safina. He holds the Endowed Chair for Nature and Humanity at Stony Brook University and is founder of the not-for-profit Safina Center. He lives on Long Island, New York with his wife, Patricia, and their dogs and feathered friends. Carl's most recent book is Becoming Wild, How Animal Cultures Raise Families, Create Beauty, and Achieve Peace. Welcome, Carl. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
And interviewing Carl today is going to be our very own Gabe Bradshaw.
Hi, and welcome. Carl, this is one less degree of separation being on Zoom together in the new Zoom living room. So thank you. It's just lovely to be together here. Typically what we do is to orient listeners and viewers is to ask the guest to reflect on their own arc, which has brought them to this moment in their life, and to touch upon the kinds of moments or milestones that may or may not be these external fantastic awards and kudos, but maybe sort of internal experiences that they had. And I wonder if you could take a few minutes to maybe talk about that and bring people up to speed to where you are.
Well, I was born in Brooklyn, New York, not a wild place, not a place with many wild animals, maybe any wild animals. But for some reason, I was always incredibly fascinated by other animals, wherever I could see them and however I could see them. My father's hobby was raising canaries, so we always had birds singing in our little apartment. It was a very small apartment. And I could watch them from a few inches away and watch a canary getting on and off its nest, feeding newly hatched chicks, watch eggs hatching, things like that. Things that a lot of other kids in much wilder places wouldn't necessarily get to see. So I had that level of intimacy with non-humans. And then when I was 7 years old, I insisted that I must raise homing pigeons. So my father helped me to fix up a shed in the backyard. We got some homing pigeons. And they were my flock. I had to do all the care and cleaning and feeding. And often I would just stand in the coop watching them because I was fascinated by what any other kind of living thing does, how it moves, anything about it. Just really, I could just watch for a long time, for hours. And when you breed pigeons, usually you put a stack of crates in the coop. We use these wooden fruit crates. And you put a bowl in there and they can figure out who they want to be married to and they can make their nest. And you let them out, they're gone for a good part of the day. And then they come back and they eat their supper and they feed their babies and then they go to bed. And right across the yard, we lived in an apartment building that was our own stack of boxes where the people had figured out who they wanted to marry and the adults were gone for a good part of the day, and then they came back and we had supper and they fed their babies and we went to bed. So from the time I was a little boy, it just occurred to me, not only intuitively, but very, very obviously, empirically, that we and other animals have a lot in common, that at the broad strokes of life we share more or less completely. And then when I was 10, we moved. It was very painful for me to have to give up my pigeons. We moved to the suburbs, And I started to have more contact with a little bit more wildlife and some more open places, and be able to go camping in the local woods and to go fishing. And I make a longer story a little shorter. I started training some hawks and owls and had some contact with some wild animals like that. And I just wanted to figure out a way to be around animals and make that a career. Some of the animals that my parents would take me to see weren't even alive. They were at the Museum of Natural History in New York. And the dioramas there with those creatures in these fantastic environments, their natural environments, were astonishing to me, because as a little boy in Brooklyn, you know, that museum was really my only sense of what the larger world looked like. And we would also go to the zoo, the Bronx Zoo, and the aquarium in Coney Island. That's where I saw sea creatures. That's where I saw many other kinds of animals that would have been totally out of reach, not only of a city kid, but a city kid with the economic means that my family had, which was next to none. So I wanted to try to make a living somehow outside with animals in some way, and blundering around, eventually found my way into a college program at a part of the New York State University system, where I was majoring in environmental studies and doing some research on birds and meeting a few people, and one thing led to another, and eventually I started to do some work with peregrine falcon reintroduction after DDT and the other pesticides killed off essentially all the wild peregrines. But once it was banned, some people at Cornell were breeding them in captivity, and I worked on releasing them to rebuild the wild population of peregrine falcons. I worked on studying terns and black skimmers with a professor that I had the last semester I was in college. And then I went to graduate school and I continued studying terns and became an ecologist. And eventually, because a lot of things were obviously deteriorating around me and there were threats to everything that I loved, I became a conservationist and worked on policy reform, especially fishing and fisheries policy, because fisheries were just wiping out all of the fish along our coasts and around the whole world. Really, many kinds of fish are terribly depleted. So I worked on improving the policy, at least in the United States, and we had great success with that. By that time, I was in my mid-30s, and I turned to doing a lot more writing, and I write articles about nature, about ecology, about animals. I've written 10 books about animals and how we're changing habitats and what those changes mean, and in some ways what the way forward could be and what a better world might look like. So that's me.
Well, can you talk a little bit about how, sort of internal perceptions and internal changes? I mean, you're describing your arc in terms of participating in the outer world. Was there a kind of a parallel internal shift and reorientation or transformation or, challenges?
Well, not much of a shift, because I thought from the time I was still in the single-digit years of my life that we and other animals had a lot in common, and everything I ever did with other animals only reinforced that, except taking classes where I was told that we were different and that you can't attribute any human thoughts or emotions to any other animals. But that never seemed right to me. And luckily, even in graduate school, I had a professor, my major advisor, also assumed from all her behavioral studies, not assumed, but from all her behavioral studies, felt a continual confirmation that other animals are sentient, that they experience life. We know that many of them have a very vivid experience of life because their senses are better than ours. Many of them have better eyesight or stronger sense of smell or much sharper hearing, or they're stronger or faster than we are. So no, there wasn't really that much shifting. The challenges had a lot more to do with whether I could actually persist in making a living doing something that involved conservation or ecology or studying animals or just being involved with nature. I didn't know anybody who did anything like that for all of my, what they call your formative years, I guess, before the middle of the time that I was in college. I had very little guidance. I was really blundering around trying to figure out how could you do something like this. And I knew a couple of people who were getting into commercial fishing, and that was a way of being outdoors and being around nature, but it wasn't really the way that I wanted to do it. I just didn't know how you did it. And eventually, by being in college and meeting some people, very, very slowly, I realized what I might do. It was really one step at a time more than a plan.
And now, do you see yourself as a scientist, or do you see yourself as a conservationist or something else?
I'm trained as a scientist, and I'm a scientist by natural predisposition. I like evidence. I don't like believing things for which there's no evidence or bad evidence. I was raised in a system where you believe things based on no evidence or bad evidence, and I didn't want to continue doing that. Science is much stronger in that way. I like finding reality out. I like finding what's really going on in the world. I like trying to confirm things myself by my own experience, my own observation. So I'm a scientist naturally like that, and also by training. I have worked to defend wild things in wild places. So by definition, I've been and am a conservationist. And mostly what I actually do now, and for a while now, is I write and I talk about the things that I write about. So, some people ask me, what are you? Sometimes I say I'm an ecologist and an author. It's just a quick way to sum it up with labels. But what I am is I'm a person who loves the living world, and circumstances, they impel and inspire me to try to defend it a bit. So.
But you yourself have encountered that in science, which we talk about as being evidence-based, has nonetheless ignored evidence. With animal sentience is actually a fairly recent sort of open admission from the academies and from various disciplines, and certainly within the sort of the balkanization of academia. We've gotten into so many sub-disciplines and things like that. I think we're now coming back into sort of an integration. But the whole concept of animal sentience has really been something that has been consistent, depending on where you start, and ebbing and flowing within proto-science, sort of with the Greeks, if you want to call that, from the Western perspective, all the way in. So what do you think about that? I mean, there has been ample evidence, and yet there's been a tremendous reluctance. So, for example, some of the things that I've written about is the disregard or the inattention to our colleagues who are neuroscientists, who are not necessarily looking for animal sentience. They're assuming animal sentience for the purpose of exploring the human mind and the human body via the things what we call animal models. And so all of that data, nonetheless, remains largely untouched by the disciplines that focus on the question of animal sentience and animal thinking, cognition. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have some thoughts about that. I think there are a lot of things tangled up in all of that, and it's a big mess, actually. but I think it's a clarifying mess. I think if you go back to, people say Descartes said that he's more or less the root in science, in my awareness and my understanding, in anything that's directly related to what we think of as science today. He's the root of, or he's regarded as the root of the idea that other animals have no feeling and are just machines. If you read a little of what he actually said, he said that all animals, including human beings, are just machines, but that what makes humans different is that we have an immortal soul, and that's why we are different than just machines. So in my view, he was entirely confused about everything, because the idea that humans differ from other animals in having immortal souls is not a scientific position, it's a religious position, and yet he's regarded as a scientist. So his view is not really, to me, is not really admissible as science. It's a religious view. Another religious view had to do with the fact that, with this exact fact that because only humans have immortal souls, according to, the Abrahamic religions anyway. There are Eastern religions that presume that everything has an immortal soul and that we're all on a wheel of karma, but that's not what leads to the problems that we're talking about. It's this idea that only humans have immortal souls, which is a view, in my limited understanding of world religions, is mainly a problem in the Abrahamic tradition, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So this idea that because humans are the only ones with immortal souls, we don't have to worry about killing other animals or whether they suffer, is logically backwards, because logically, if humans have immortal souls, it doesn't matter if you kill a human, because they have immortal souls. You can't really kill them. If you kill an animal without an immortal soul, you take everything it has. You take its entirety. That's a much greater transgression. So how you get from humans are the only ones with immortal souls, so therefore we can kill any other animal, logically, I don't understand that. The absolute opposite makes sense. And the way that that's been viewed makes no sense. Then I think you have the beginnings of people trying to make a science, finally, a science out of animal behavior. And that really, there were a few precursors to that as early as maybe the 1920s, but we're talking about something extremely recent. And before that, there were scientists who casually treated the subject, like Charles Darwin. He just assumed, based on I shouldn't keep saying assume. He saw, based on the obvious behavioral evidence, that other animals were very aware of what was going on around them, that they had some strategies, and they had things that they were trying to do and things that they were trying to avoid. This was not an issue for him. But there wasn't really a science of animal behavior until about the 1940s and 50s, with Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen and a few other people like that. And I think what they said, and I think rightly so, if you're trying to establish an evidence-based science, is don't assume anything at all about other animals and what they can experience. That's good. You shouldn't assume anything if you're trying to have an evidence-based endeavor of any kind. And they had all this mythology to overcome, like ants are industrious, but grasshoppers are lazy, and foxes are clever. All these things that came out of fables and mythology. So they just said, look, stop, believe nothing at all, just watch what happens, and let's see. At that time, there was essentially no brain science and almost no neurobiology the way that we understand it today. So the idea that you could not address the inner experience of animals was somewhat logical at the time. You couldn't look at their brains, you couldn't look at brain waves, you couldn't look at electrical activity in brains. You could just see what they did, and that's what they said, just see what they did and just describe what they do. Our science will be a descriptive one, just describe what they do. But then that hardened into this idea that you're not allowed to even ask the question, and you're not allowed to worry or wonder about the mental experience of other animals. And that again gets more like a religious position than a scientific one, because in science you're supposed to be allowed to ask questions and see what the evidence is. So I viewed that as a not scientific stretch of years, which lasted a long time, decades actually. But in my sense of things now, all of that is crumbling because we now have about 50 years of behavioral studies of free-living animals. We have about 50 or 60 years of good neurobiology in which we've learned an awful lot, not only about how our minds work and how our nervous system works, but the fact that our nervous system and that of all vertebrates is essentially the same, and it's run by the same brain chemicals and neurotransmitters that create mood and motivation in us. So, and if you simply look at the behavior of animals and the logic of what they do, they act afraid when there's danger. They act aggressive if they think they need to defend themselves. They approach potential mates. They repel potential rivals. They are attracted to potential food. So this is all very logical, and that logic in their behaviors shows the workings of a mind. You can see brains, and we now have seen a lot about brains, and we see the near identicalness of brains, and especially the emotional parts of the hardware of brains. We can't see a mind, but we only see evidence of a mind. We see evidence of human minds and human behavior and human responses to the world, and we see evidence of other animals' minds in their behavior and their responses to the world. So I think this idea that other animals are not sentient from a scientific point of view is completely crumbling. I've never gotten any pushback on this from any scientists. In fact, scientists that I didn't know or had only heard of wrote to me about my first book on this subject, which was called Beyond Words, to say they thought it was really good. I didn't get any pushback. And the number of scientists that I've encountered who believe that any vertebrate, in the case I'm thinking fish, have no experience of the world and are complete machinery is two people, only two people. And they are incredibly in the minority of scientists, and especially behavioral scientists. But then the other tangle is we have a lot of people who never think about any of these kinds of issues at all, and they're raised like I was raised, in households that simply regard meat as food, and we just get meat as a product. We didn't kill our own meat, with the exception of fish that we caught. But millions, I mean hundreds of millions of people around the world, they grow up around meat or around animals that are destined to be killed. They're not taught any empathy. They don't show any empathy. And we have I don't know how many billion-dollar industrial farming complex that is, well, actually all animal farming is pretty much predicated on the idea that the animals you're raising are animals you will kill eventually. That's true even of dairy cows and laying hens. So people who are involved in all of that, they're not really thinking too much about questions of sentience. They've never been around people who thought too much about questions of sentience. And that is still enormously strong around the world. You know, there are very, very many people who never occurred to them to not eat meat, much less to, quote, give up meat. But those who have, I think it's just very, very apparent to them that other animals have sensations of pleasure and pain and misery. I think the main problem with our farming system is not that we kill the animals, because every individual dies. We're all going to die one way or another. But the worst problem is they're made to live much more miserably than they're made to die. To me, that's really the worst problem, is how they're made to live, not even the fact that they're made to die, grim though that is. And what was it, the last thing I was going to say? Yeah, but to circle back around to talking about the scientific view of things, I don't sense that there are a lot of scientists anymore who are dug into the idea that other animals have no experience of the world, have no senses of pleasure or pain, have no emotions. I sense that is something that is swiftly becoming completely passé. But there are many millions of people who simply don't care that they do. So that's a whole other realm. So those are my views on it anyway.
Now, with your book that was so astounding beyond words, that you've spoken about, it was kind of a revelation or a turning point or some kind of epiphany, or was a shift for you with the creation of that book. Is that true? And how does that link back to your childhood? In other words, are you feeling there's I'm focusing on sort of internal transformations and putting together.
Well, I heard you on the radio talking about elephants having post-traumatic stress disorder, and you didn't say they had something like it. You said they have it, and that it was identical to our experiences. And I had never really thought of that before. And it simply got me thinking about the range of, I guess, in a sense, the range of empathy that I feel toward different animals, and why do I feel that range? So I got your book, and I was reading your book on a boat while I was in a cabin that was open to the sea. And I remember I was trying to figure out at that time what my angle for my next book was going to be. So I had a lot of thoughts that were running around in my mind, and there I am reading your book, which I thought was very thought-provoking, and I'm watching dolphins through the door of my cabin while I was reading your book, and I was, trying to understand the range of how I felt about other animals, specifically with regard to killing them, and why I felt that way. And my feeling was, I feel like it's murder to kill an elephant or an ape or a dolphin. I don't feel like it's murder to kill a deer, although I don't want to kill a deer ever. And I do kill fish because fish are, I grew up fishing. They remain a substantial part of my food supply. I like having some agency in my food supply. I don't like the idea of buying all my food. It seems very anonymous. I think I want to have a more intimate relationship with my food and the world. So why is it? Is this based on anything, or is it just nonsense that I feel that way? And even those feelings shift over time. But anyway, a few years ago when I was thinking about this in this way, what I thought was the difference was the fact that there are some species, a minority of species, but probably quite a lot if you counted them, that live in social groups where each individual is known to each other individual as an individual. And this is true certainly true for apes, certainly true for elephants, certainly true for a variety of marine mammals. And so who they are depends on who they're with, because they're known as individuals. So if you were to do something like kill one of them and remove it, it would be missed. And I thought that was less true of many ungulates that live in large herds. It's turning out to be more true than I thought, I would say, as we are learning more about them. And for the kinds of fish that I fish for, they live in very large schools. The schools are always changing in their makeup. They don't have any long-term relationships. If you think of something like a mosquito, they don't have a social group. You know, each mosquito is pretty much the same as each other mosquito in that way. So, you know, there I am reading your book, looking at the dolphins, thinking about all these things, and I thought, well, how to sum that up in one phrase or one sentence? And I thought, well, there are some animals that, because their individuality matters to other individuals, let's say that they are who animals. They're somebody to somebody else. They're not it, they're who. And something like a mosquito, you could say a mosquito is, socially speaking, isn't it, because it's not part of a social group, and as an individual, its presence or absence will not be missed by other mosquitoes. So that was my thinking at the time, this range from who animals to it animals. And I do think that accounts for the range of feeling that I have about the idea of our relationship with other animals as far as food specifically is concerned. I don't want to have anything to do with industrial farming or commercial farming. And we do have at our home, we have some products of the industrial food system. We have some laying hens, we buy them. We assume that they just are out of some awful farm someplace that just produces these things by the many thousands and kills all the males. We know that goes on. But yet we have these laying hens. We do like them. They're very companionable. We like their eggs. And they are completely free. They're not at all confined during the day. They go into the coop for safety at night. We just close the door. And when they get too old to lay eggs, nothing at all happens that's any different from the rest of their life, except that they're not laying eggs anymore. So that kind of sums up my range of feelings and how I came to see my own feelings for why I have that range of feelings.
So, but it seems that you're, in a sense, talking about the evolution or the development of an ethic, take it in its broadest sense of something that guides us to do what we do or don't do what we do or say or think, which is relationally based. In other words, that the meaning of, and I would say a value, we'll just use that as a place word right now, the value that influences an individual is conditioned on a relational existence in that sense. So in other words, is that the value, or I don't want to, I mean, I don't like using the word value, that's kind of, but in other words, there's a sort of an ordering, we'll put it that way, there's an ordering in nature and our own society, which gives precedence to a relational existence. In other words, if an individual, as we call individuals, are relationally defined and recognizable, then that is kind of a guide for our ethics.
Well, that I guess would be true in the case of how I think about other animals with regard to both captivity. Well, captivity is a little different. Food anyway. As I said, I think our captivity system is just very cruel, and I don't want to have anything to do with that. But we all have to eat. And so even people who are complete vegans, they also have this ordering, right? Their ordering is they want a completely cruelty-free food supply. But to me, that's problematic, because if you're eating broccoli, the broccoli comes from a farm. Farm used to be wild habitat that was available as living space for a lot of other species, even an organic farm. Now, most farms are full of pesticides and industrial fertilizers and are problems in that way. But even an organic farm has taken living space away from every other thing that might live there to grow broccoli or Brussels sprouts or carrots or whatever it is. So there's a trade-off between animals living, even if you're just growing vegetables and just eating vegetables. This, you know, so for a vegan who orders the world as saying, I want it cruelty-free, broccoli is the answer. For me as an ecologist, broccoli is not a clear answer. If I go fishing, I don't make any pretense to the idea that the fish on the line is trying to get away. It's stressed. It would rather be alive. I intend to kill it for food. This is a problem. And when they get in, I try to catch them quickly. I try to kill them quickly. But they got to be who they were supposed to be until that moment. Just like actually trillions of fish in the ocean that are killed every day by trillions of other things that live in the ocean. I mean, we do have to understand that in the natural world, all animals eat something. They kill something to eat. This is the predicament that we're all stuck in here on this planet. And in the ocean, it's not like if I don't catch a fish, no fish get killed. Everything in the ocean is killing fish all the time for food. So I'm sort of confronted with this dilemma in a way. Do I buy my vegetables from a farm, or do I have a large part of my food supply come from living space that is still available and will be available after I'm there and get what I want from it? If I go and catch a couple of fish for dinner, I don't deplete or diminish the ability of the ocean to produce more fish. But if I'm buying vegetables, I am diminishing the ability of land to be living space for other creatures. And to me, as an ecologist, this is a dilemma. And the way that I have made my compromise in this dilemma is I don't eat farm animals or buy their products. I do catch fish and I dig clams. Clams are animals. What experience clams have of the world, I'm not sure. And I have a small garden. I try to buy my greens from a local greengrocer. All of it is imperfect. Being here is imperfect. We're only trying to do a little bit of what we can do. And, you know, even people, we're just talking about food right now, and food as it relates to animals, but even all the vegans I know, they get in airplanes, they get in cars, they do all the things that we do in this dilemma that we're partly trapped in, of where we live and how we live in this society. And we may try to live as lightly as we can, but there is literally no free lunch here, and you can only try to make a whole series of compromises, I think.
So what has the new parameters of the COVID pandemic, which has made a major shift in terms of I would say all human, you know, some to a greater, some to a lesser extent, way of doing business. What do you see as this an opportunity? What are the kinds of things? It gets down to our question is, we now know, you know, you've even given some examples of what is wrong, you know, or what seems to be contradictory. What are some things that you see that we can start to envision to start afresh by putting all the knowledge? I mean, you've been talking about various kinds of things. How should we envision the future? I mean, we're sort of at a reboot time. So from that perspective of a rebooting, obviously there's fallout, you know, but what is the goal? What does it look like for you?
Well, for me, well, let me just
I mean,
preface.
it may be on your life, but I mean in the sense of what is your vision
Yeah.
after we've rebooted? And again, you've given wonderful examples of the contradictions and the difficulties. What is your vision that you think we should pursue? I mean, doesn't mean turn it overnight. It's a vision of kind of like, where are we going?
Right. Right.
What does that look like concretely for humanity?
Well, let me just preface this. If we're going to talk about the opportunities that the COVID pandemic is providing, I should say that there are many, many people who are in an incredible amount of economic pain right now. The illness aside, there are obviously people who are sick and dying of the illness, but there are a lot of people who literally are completely running out of money and have no idea where they're going to get food from. And that includes single parents with several dependent children. And so I don't want to act like this is such a great opportunity to do things better. It is a little bit instructive. The opportunity to do things better was present before the pandemic. A few months ago, we had the same opportunities. I think what the pandemic is showing those of us who have such newly limited activity schedules is we don't have to travel very much in order to connect a lot with people. That seems to be a good thing. We can get more of our food locally. That seems to be a good thing. Slowing down and just throttling down, mixing goals of work and work productivity with goals and needs of family is, I think, a good thing. I mean, there are a lot of people who are so driven about their need to be productive in their jobs that they forget the humanity that's needed in their own families and in their own communities. So the throttling down, the slowing down, the great reduction in the travel that most of us had planned, I think is instructive, and I think is in many ways a good thing. So that's what I think the COVID epidemic is showing us. I think the larger vision that I've had for what an ideal world would look like is kind of three things. There's the golden rule as far as community and human interaction, and as far as cruelty with other beings. There's the need to drastically reduce the amount of the world that is occupied by human beings, and increasingly so. I mean, we continue to spread ourselves over the world by taking all of this living space from all of the other creatures and destabilizing the systems that support life. That's not a good thing on the only planet that we will have and the only living planet that we know of. So I think, the human population has tripled in my lifetime. When I was born, nobody said the big problem with the world is that there weren't enough people. There were around 1 billion people at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Nobody at that time said that the main problem was there were not enough people. In fact, Malthus was starting to say that a looming problem is we may have too many people. So we're supposed to get to 10 billion people, and I don't see how that's remotely possible without destabilizing everything that we care about, ranging from peace to simply the ability to have enough food and wood and water. It's not just a matter of feeding everybody. This is the constant thing I keep hearing and reading about. We have enough food, they say, for 10 or 20 billion people. Well, that's not a solution. That's the problem. The problem is that we could grow enough food. But what are you going to do about wood? What are you going to do about water? What are you going to do about metal and mining? All the pollutants that are created with all the farming that will be needed, the destabilization of the atmosphere and the acidification of the ocean that we're doing right now. So I think that scaling back, so we have the golden rule, scaling the human population down to about 1 billion, which could be done by the full gender equity and full citizenship for women, and some financial incentives over maybe a couple of 100 years would bring the population down a lot voluntarily, because the big secret of rich people, everybody wants to be a rich person, the big secret of rich people is small families make bigger lives. So, you know, around the world, the very, very poorest people who have the least have the most children, and a little bit of medicine is letting a lot of those children survive when in the past a lot of them would die. So surviving is good, but you need to have a two-part system there. If we're going to prevent a lot of people from the misery and suffering of dying, then we have to give them the tools and the options for having the number of children that they would like to have, instead of a lot more. And then the third thing is every other thing that lives in the world needs a place to live. There's no justification for taking life and space away from everything else. So I had this idea when I was in college that if we are, as one species out of tens of millions of species, took half the world for ourselves, that wouldn't be fair, but it would be a lot better than what we're doing. And I thought, well, nobody's ever going to listen to that. But the great Edward Wilson had the same idea not too many years ago and wrote a book called Half Earth. And now there's a movement to try to protect half of the world for other living things. I think, you know, it should be more like 1/10 for us, maybe, and 90% for the tens of millions of other species. But all right, let's say half. So that would be my vision. The golden rule shared by 1 billion people, with plenty of living room for all of the other things that got this far along with us. We have no more right to be here, or any right to be here in these overwhelming numbers, than does any other species. So that would be what I think is the you know, the ideal world that I dream about, I guess.
Do you think that humans are really different than the rest of the other species?
Well, yeah, pretty much every species is different from the rest of other species. That's why they exist. They've found a different way of being and a different way of exploiting some niche that lets them be. Humans have obvious differences from all of the other species, which we know those differences best because we are humans and we're most interested in ourselves and we know the most about ourselves. Elephants are different from all the other species. Orcas are different. Grasshoppers are different. They're all different. Humans are different. We have a human-like language that allows us to do things. And we're incredible tinkerers. We make a lot of different tools, and all of that has been accelerating tremendously. Well into the 20th century, there was still a lot of existing cultures that did not have any tools with any moving parts. Our acceleration of our tinkering has been really breathtaking, and those are the ways in which I think we're different from other species. But, you know, so what, in a sense? That's good for the experience of being human. In some ways, it's good. In some ways, it's bad.
But as you pointed out, there were a lot of humans, and are a lot of humans, that are not doing the kinds of things that we're doing. You know, to me, I guess that the question I'm getting at is that are at the heart of the issues that you're talking about, and then talking about your vision, is the heart of it this understanding and acceptance assumption, as you always talk about, assume that's like an ass makes, what is it, an ass makes you and me or something. Anyways, is that we are different. And from a genetic perspective, from physiological perspectives, from so many different perspectives, the samenesses are far outweigh the differences. And so I guess my question to you is that really the root of the problem? Is this acceptance and assumption of our difference? And by definition, then separating, and as you wrote eloquently in that article I told you I love so much in Medium, that the pandemic, and if you look at the pandemic and all the other kinds of viruses, are created because of what this differencing has done, and that it really is that we are one. This is not my language, this is it, that essentially until we resolve this sort of obsession of difference and being okay with difference and being okay with differencing, creating this differencing pathway, we will continue to have the kinds of situations that we've created for today.
Well, I would not disagree with that, but I think of it a little differently. I think what you said is true. I think our main problem is not a recognition that we as a species are different from other species, because as I said, all species are different from all other species. In some way, that's why they're species. But it's our abusive, well, it's our brutality. Our brutality, I think, is the problem. I don't think it's recognizing difference that is the problem. For instance, we recognize that the dogs in our household are different from children in our household, let's say, or my dogs are different from my wife, but we're all family. We all care about each other, and we care about our dogs, and we would like to have them have happy lives, and we do have happy lives together. So, but I don't see them as the same as me. I don't see my wife as the same as me, for that matter. She's different. She's had different experiences. She has different temperament. I don't think it's the recognition of differences that is the core problem. Although, as you stated it, I wouldn't argue with the way that you stated it. I think that what you said is true. But I think it's our brutality, our brutalizing of other cultures, other people, other species, the physical world itself. That's the problem.
But where does that brutalizing come from? I mean, it comes from this isn't anything I've made up. This is a sort of a trope, which is that the differencing, in other words, you brought that up yourself, where you have empathy for the fish that you're fishing, and you certainly have empathy with people that you work with, yet you call murder an elephant, and it's not murdering a fish, and it would be definitely murdering me, if you decided to fish for me. So again, there's that kind of difference, and I know this is a thorny kind of a question, but I guess what I'm really working at, and you've delved so deeply in this in your work and your experience as a scientist. I mean, I'm using that as a label, as someone who has experienced, that was a very important point you made, is it's not just that you see data, it has to do with your own experience. And I think that's absolutely critical. And it's that kind of experience of connection and oneness, I think, which is the glue, which keeps things together in what we call nature, which is quote unquote other than humans, and which, again, this is a generalization with indigenous people. Again, they're all very varied and but relatively speaking, for example, in North America, when Euro, English, whatever, whoever came from that part came here, the landscapes, the seascapes, the waterscapes, had a very, very different tenor, had a very different kind of richness to them, which changed radically when the colonization occurred. Now, again, with the indigenous people, and I'm not familiar, this is anecdotal through talking with colleagues who come from American Indian backgrounds and other backgrounds, and then my own readings. But generally speaking, if you're just looking at a data and you look at this, there's a hell of a lot more oysters, there's a hell of a lot more deer, a hell of a lot more beaver, blah, 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 right? So relatively speaking, and you could talk, you could say that was a population thing, but that to me is kind of a side issue, that the difference in the perception was difference, that it was seen, North America was seen as something different than me as a colonizer coming there, from which I could use and take. So
Well,
I guess what I'm just saying is this differencing notion, which is still very deeply ingrained. And the reason I bring that up is, again, that article that you wrote about in the Medium. I encourage everyone to read that. I mean, it is technical and very scientifically depth, but it's got this resonance to it of really saying, what you see is what you get. We destroyed, and then we were allowing, I'm sorry to simplify it, you said it much more eloquently, but I've forgotten her name. She wrote a 2016 book called Pandemic, and she was talking about the fact of, this is prior to this viral, is that dengue fever, cholera, Lyme's disease, everything, all of those existed. Those little bacteria and virus existed. When they became a quote unquote problem, an epidemic, was when we destroyed the environment, whether it was killing the deer, suburbanizing that. In Florida, she talked about the examples of the foreclosures, which left all these houses with pools unattended and lawns unattended, which became mosquito air. In other words, and then those then these viruses and became pandemic, became epidemic at least. So I guess I'm because I felt you really articulated so beautifully this notion of this profound need to not see difference. Difference is different than discernment. So I don't eat you, I eat, a broccoli. Obviously these things, there is discernment. But I'm just talking about in the sense of really your thoughts about moving forward with this notion of oneness, banning this notion of any kind of differencing whatsoever. I don't know if I left you room for an answer. I just left, a question with an answer.
It's a biological fact that all living things are organically family. That's true, and it's a fact that all life is one in that organic sense. That's true. But we're not all the same. I mean, in a way, there's a general equality throughout life, but there are differences. Plants are different than animals, and animals are different from one another. I think what you're talking about is the kind of perception of difference that says you're the other, and therefore it's you're either threatening to me, or it's okay for me to destroy you because you're other. I'm not sure that we as humans had that view of the world prior to farming, because many tribal and indigenous societies, to the limited extent that I understand them, had a lot more respect for nature. They had a lot more respect for the power of nature. They had a lot of respect for the power of other animals. They saw in other animals spiritual beings, spirit guides. They either respected or in some cases worshipped their prowess as hunters, or they identified with hunters, such as identifying with wolves or identifying with orca whales as incredible hunters in human tribal society that involved a lot of hunting. Or they would have ceremonies for the first kill of a season, like the first fish in the salmon rivers that would run upstream to spawn. Many of those tribal people had first fish ceremonies so that they would thank the fish for coming back because they respected them. They feared that a lack of respect would result in them not returning. We've kind of proven that to be true by not respecting them and having them falling apart. And
but is that a kind of a thing that you would think that we could cultivate again? Like
all of this is cultivated, yes, because it's purely cultural. You can be taught how to brutalize animals, or you can be taught that they don't feel anything, or you can be taught to respect them and that you must not make them suffer. You can be taught all of these different things, and
for example, you brought up, I have to ask you this because you're the biologist. The orca, for example, which I always found phenomenal, is that the orca, unless they were in captivity, have never killed a human. At least there's not in the Euro-American record, scientific record, and there isn't
no record
on that.
Right.
So the thing is they are, from the way you were describing orcas and elephants, same brains and relational and very, very tight cultures and tight society. To me, it's been fascinating that why is that such a strong ethic that they have what we have, right? And they are relational, like you said, they identify with each other, and they're carnivores, and yet they don't kill humans. Do you have any thoughts on that? And why are they continuing to teach their children these kinds of things?
Well, that's probably true of wolves also in North America. In Southern Africa, apparently lions never killed the San people that we call Bushmen. They had an understanding with each other, although leopards sometimes did kill people, but lions apparently never did. There were these kind of mutual understandings for I think different reasons. I think in the case of the lions and the San people, there was probably a mutual recognition of their abilities with their own weapons, that they're mutually dangerous, so better to just not cause trouble. Maybe the same situation with wolves and native North American people. And not really a need to cause trouble anyway, because there was plenty of food other than humans. Humans were, probably difficult to view as prey. Maybe a little too dangerous.
Or not tasting good enough.
Maybe not tasting good enough. And with the orcas, it's a little odd with the orcas because there seem to be two different things going on. On the simplified side, the different, what they call types of orcas, they're very, very, very fussy about what they eat, and they don't like to try new things. So the ones that eat fish only eat fish. The ones that eat marine mammals only eat marine mammals. There are some in the Antarctic that only eat penguins. They ignore all the seals that other orcas there specialize on catching. It may be as simple as they don't regard people as food because they don't see people in the water much, and they've never been taught that they're edible, and who knows if they're any good or if they're dangerous. Maybe just avoid them. They're not what we eat. It might be as simple as that. But it does appear that even though humans are confused about whether other animals are sentient and can understand things or feel things, the other animals don't have that problem. They seem to easily understand that people are capable of seeing and thinking and responding. And wild orcas sometimes have played with people. A friend of mine, well, there was that famous one, Luna, who got separated from her family and lived for several years free living, but in isolation from other orcas in British Columbia, she would fool around with people. She would come over and start spitting water and goad people into playing with her. She'd come up to kayaks that she could easily knock people into the water, into very cold water. She never, it was a he, Luna was a he. He never did that. But if he came up to a sailboat he wanted to play with, he'd give it a big shove. He would never give a kayak a big shove. He seemed to understand that he needed to be gentle when he needed to be gentle. There's a really good video on YouTube of a dolphin off Hawaii with a fishhook in its flipper going over to some scuba divers and showing them the hook. And then the divers start to work to take the hook out. They're breathing scuba, but you know, the dolphin needs to breathe. So the dolphin goes to the surface at one point, gets another breath of air, and comes back to continue letting this guy with a pair of pliers take the hook out of its flipper. Now, that is a recognition by them that we have minds. That shows you that they have minds and that they also have a kind of understanding and a kind of empathy that, bizarrely, we often seem to lack.
So is that kind of what you're suggesting, is that we might, in this pause, you know, to start listening and directing our culture toward those icons of empathy? And
well, I think we might, if we have the luxury of thinking about these things like you and I have. But if we want to be completely hard-nosed and practical about it, we've created a series of epidemics. Most of them were much more deadly than COVID. Many of them killed 30, 60% of the people infected, but were not as infectious, as contagious as COVID. The fact that COVID is infectious at the level that it is, but only kills about 3% of the people that it infects, is pure luck. And we've had an accelerating series of these epidemics. And where do they all come from? All of them originate from our broken and brutal relationship with the rest of the living world. The wild animals that are not normal human food that we are eating in increasing amounts and increasing numbers while making incursions deeper and deeper into their living space, while we destroy that living space with the macerator that our current industrial human world has made itself. And the industrialized farm animals that are the source of swine flu and bird flu, those kind of epidemics that luckily did not get to be pandemics, but were much more deadly and got to several countries before they were stopped. Luckily for us, they were stopped. So immediately, these wild animal markets should be ended completely everywhere. And the way that we have industrialized these factory farms needs to be significantly undone or eliminated. I mean, eliminating it is hard to imagine, but it wasn't very long ago that we did not grow animals in factories like they were only products. They were on small farms, they were scattered around. We've created these test tubes for viruses and other pathogens by cramming all these things together in the most unnatural ways, in the filthiest, most miserable conditions. And the viral responses are, they just keep doing what living things do. They keep making little differences within themselves to see if they can get a bigger market share of the world. And there are now more than 7 billion of us. That's a pretty big market share that this one new virus right now, COVID, the one that causes COVID, has found a way to exploit. we're very, very much playing with fire and playing a game of Russian roulette with these viruses. And all of it comes from the brutal and miserable way that we treat other animals, wild and domestic.
Are there specific things that you're directing your work toward as a result of this, or that it sort of piqued it in some fashion?
Well, not immediately. I mean, when I'm focusing more on books, and books take a few years, and it takes a little bit of retrospective to see what you want to create a book about. I've written a little bit about this epidemic, including that article on Medium that caught your attention recently. But I don't really know. I don't know where this is going to go and how rapidly or how slowly we will come out of it. There are a couple of scenarios I can imagine where we will come out of it within 2 or 3 years, and there's some scenarios where this is going to be around for the rest of our lives. And nobody knows what will happen, or whether a vaccine will just sort of end the conversation we're trying to have, which is, let's rethink our relationship with the rest of the world. I mean, in a way, I would love there to be a vaccine, because I don't want other people to be getting sick or die. I don't want to get sick. I don't want to die of something as ridiculous as COVID. But a vaccine would also stop the conversation of how can we do things better. And it would give us another free pass to keep doing the same things that have created such misery for so many other living things and created these deadly problems for human beings.
Have your conversations with colleagues and students and all changed?
Well, we certainly talk about this a lot. We talk about it every day. And yeah, the silver linings are part of the discussion. What's good about the fact that people's activity is way, way down from what it was? What opportunities does this give us to rethink things? I have a student whose her internship that was going to be her summer project was canceled. So instead she's writing about the responses of various animals to the, to the various kinds of shutdowns that people are doing. It's been good and bad for other animals. Other animals that were too heavily reliant on people have started to starve, and you've probably seen reports about starving rats in New Orleans and starving monkeys in Thailand. On the other hand, we've also seen stories about animals coming into suburbs and cities where they would normally never venture. So at the very least, that's interesting.
And would you like to say some final thoughts about a new book that you're writing, or?
If I was writing a new book already, I would love to say some final thoughts, but alas, I'm only considering what my next book can be, and thinking about what it should be, and partly in light of how this pandemic has thrown into such hard relief the deadly problems we cause for ourselves with our brutalization of the rest of the world. It's not really a great topic to think, that a lot of people would want to read about that.
Bestseller. Yeah.
Trying to figure out a way to create a novel around that, a fictional story around that would be good. I don't know if I can, but those are some of the things on my mind.
Have you had some personal psychological changes through this period?
A little bit, not so much as many people. I mean, for one thing, I've always worked at home, so that's not much of a change. And because I had 2 new books come out in April, I had a whole spring lineup of speaking engagements and getting on an awful lot of airplanes and going to a lot of places. I enjoy the speaking and I enjoy meeting the people. I don't like going out on the airplane trips. It's exhausting. It makes me feel bad about all the fuel that gets burned on my behalf. So in a way, you know, that trade-off of seeing all that canceled, that was kind of okay with me. It's distracting, worrying about these problems, and I have some close friends who are both hospital workers who are under a tremendous amount of stress and strain. I worry about them. So all of this stuff that we hear about, that we read about, that our friends are more at risk about, yeah, it takes a little bit of a toll. And I think that because I've always worked at home, and because I've just, you know, literally closed the book on a couple of book projects, I'm in pretty good shape relative to a lot of people for the time being. So it is distracting and a little bit de-energizing to worry about all the people in my community and my friends and some of my relatives, especially the older ones.
Mm-hmm. Are you in touch with a lot of international colleagues as well?
I wouldn't say a lot, but yes, some. Yeah, everybody's in the same predicament right now,
Mm-hmm.
and some people have seen not only their jobs ended, but their businesses maybe never coming back. Some of them maybe their profession never coming back. My sister is a massage therapist. That not only did her income stop 100%, but it's it's possible that that profession is going to be on ice for years. So yeah, there's a lot to worry about. I'm worried about myself less than I'm worried about a lot of people around me.
Well, thank you so much, Carl. It was a delight to have you here, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, it was a delight and an honor to be with you. I know these are hard things to talk about, but we can't look away from them, or we will doom ourselves to more of these issues and more of these problems. So
Well,
I
we
appreciate
appreciate
your focus on what the path forward should be is the right focus. So thank you for that.
Okay. Well, take care, all right? Keep in touch.
Okay.
And congratulations on your book.
Thanks so much.
Books.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.